The evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Maria Dawson walked into the large department store. She had just finished her long day at work, and her shoulders carried both the weight of duty and the quiet pride of her position. Nobody looking at her in that moment could guess that she was an experienced FBI agent. Dressed in a simple blouse, jeans, and comfortable shoes, she looked like any ordinary woman going about her shopping. That was exactly how Maria wanted it. She valued her privacy and rarely flaunted her position. To the world outside, she was just another face in the crowd. Maria was there to buy a few gifts for her niece's upcoming birthday. Her niece, a lively 10-year-old, loved books, dolls, and puzzles. As Maria pushed her cart down the aisle, she carefully picked out a stack of colorful books, a small jewelry box for children, and a bright pink dress she knew her niece would adore. She smiled to herself as she imagined her niece's joy. For Maria, these simple family moments mattered more than any award or title she had earned in her demanding career. What Maria did not notice right away was that 2 uniformed police officers had entered the store on their routine patrol. Officer Grant, tall and heavy-set, had a habit of scanning shoppers with suspicion rather than care. His partner, Officer Miller, younger but eager to prove himself, mirrored the same behavior. As their eyes fell on Maria, something in their expressions shifted. They whispered to each other while pretending to browse the racks near the entrance. Maria, focused on her shopping, had no idea she had already become the subject of their private conversation. Maria made her way toward the toy section and paused to compare 2 dolls. The officers stood a little distance away, watching every move she made. When she slipped the doll into her cart after checking its price tag, Officer Grant muttered under his breath. To him, her calm and confident body language looked suspicious. He was quick to assume rather than to observe carefully. Miller followed his lead without question. They continued trailing her, hiding their intentions behind casual steps, but their eyes stayed fixed on her cart. By the time Maria reached the counter to check out, the officers had already formed their opinion. The cashier scanned each item and bagged them carefully. Maria handed over her card, smiled politely, and collected her receipt. She was ready to head home, content with her small purchase and already thinking about what meal she would cook for dinner. But just as she stepped toward the exit, she heard a loud voice echo through the store. "Ma'am, stop right there." It was Officer Grant. Maria turned around, surprised. "Yes, officer?" she asked politely, though the sudden attention unsettled her. Everyone in line froze, eyes shifting between the police and the woman carrying shopping bags. Grant marched toward her, Miller right behind. "We need to check your bags," Grant said loudly. His tone was sharp, designed to draw attention. Several shoppers stopped in their tracks, eager to see what was happening. Maria frowned slightly but remained calm. "I just paid for everything. You can check my receipt if you'd like," she said. Holding up the slip, Miller shook his head, smirking as though he already knew something others didn't. "We got a report that you slipped jewelry into your bag without paying," he claimed. The words were clear, but the accusation hung in the air like a heavy stone. Gasps rose from the small crowd that had gathered. Maria blinked in disbelief. "That's not true," she said firmly. "Please check the cameras. Everything is right here on the receipt." But Grant's voice grew louder, drawing more attention. "Don't try to act clever. We've been watching you. You fit the profile." His last words cut sharply, carrying an undertone that made several people exchange uncomfortable glances. It was not just an accusation of theft, but something deeper, rooted in prejudice. Maria's heart pounded, not out of fear but frustration. She had worked for years to uphold justice, to train officers about fairness and truth. Now she was standing in the middle of a store being humiliated for something she hadn't done. She looked at the crowd around her. Some shoppers whispered in sympathy, while others stared with judgment. The store manager appeared near the counter but hesitated, clearly too nervous to get involved. "I insist you let me explain," Maria said, her voice still calm though her patience was wearing thin. "I have the receipt and the cameras will confirm everything. I did not take anything without paying." Grant ignored her completely. "Put the bags on the counter," he ordered. His partner stood tall as if ready to block her escape. Maria placed the bags down, watching them go through each item. Of course, they found nothing unusual. Every item was tagged, scanned, and listed clearly on the receipt. Instead of admitting they were wrong, Miller narrowed his eyes. "She's hiding it somewhere else. People like her always do. he muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. A few in the crowd frowned at the unnecessary remark. Maria could feel her blood boil, but she remained steady. Losing her temper would only feed their bias. "This is harassment," Maria said quietly, almost to herself, but the firmness in her voice was unmistakable. She knew the situation was spiraling into something dangerous. She also knew she could not reveal her identity too soon. The truth had to come out at the right moment. Grant smirked, mistaking her composure for fear. "We'll have to conduct a further search," he said, leaning closer. "Unless you confess right now." Maria raised her chin slightly and met his gaze. Her eyes were calm but unyielding. "Are you absolutely sure you want to go down this road, officer?" she asked in a tone that carried both warning and authority. But the officers took it as arrogance. The tension thickened in the room. The shoppers waited, torn between disbelief and curiosity. A young mother whispered to her child to stay quiet. An elderly man shook his head in disapproval. The store manager wiped his forehead nervously, wishing the ground would swallow him. But the officers only tightened their grip on the situation. Maria took a deep breath. She had handled hardened criminals, faced armed suspects, and negotiated tense situations that could have ended in tragedy. Yet, here she was, surrounded by simple shoppers, accused of something she had not done, all because two men with badges saw her as a target. She knew the truth would reveal itself. But she also knew these officers were digging themselves into a hole they would never escape. As Grant reached for her arm to lead her away for a more invasive search, Maria's eyes narrowed. She whispered again, this time only to herself. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The crowd grew restless, unsure what would happen next. And Maria, though calm, prepared herself for the storm that was about to break, because she knew once the truth came out, everything would change. The store became so quiet that the sound of the air conditioner and the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed louder than the people around. Maria stood straight, her shopping bags neatly placed on the counter, while the two officers circled her like hunters around prey. They had already checked her bags, found nothing, and ignored the proof written clearly on her receipt. Yet their pride, mixed with prejudice, refused to let them step back. For them, admitting they were wrong felt harder than accusing an innocent woman. Officer Grant moved closer, his voice raised to ensure everyone in the store heard him. "She thinks she's clever, but thieves always find a way to hide things. If it's not in the bag, then it must be on her body." His words carried a weight that made several people gasp. A mother clutched her daughter's hand tightly and whispered something in her ear. An older man shook his head, muttering, "This isn't right," but his voice was too soft to matter. Maria inhaled slowly, holding her composure. Her years of training had taught her not to let emotions control her actions, especially in moments when her dignity was under attack. She looked calmly at the officers and said, "You've already checked my bags. I showed you the receipt. I paid for every single item. Why don't you do the reasonable thing? Ask for the security footage. That will prove the truth." But Officer Miller crossed his arms and smirked. "We don't need cameras. We've been watching you. People like you are always tricky. You've got something on you and we're going to find it." The phrase "people like you" stung, not because Maria was ashamed, but because she had heard those words far too often in her life. It was never about truth. It was about assumptions, about the way someone looked or carried themselves. She met his eyes with a quiet strength and replied, "You're making a mistake, a very big one." The crowd around her grew larger as curious shoppers left their aisles to witness the spectacle. The store manager stood behind the counter, wringing his hands nervously. He wanted to intervene, but the fear of crossing uniformed police officers kept him frozen. He knew their tone was wrong, but he also knew the weight of their authority in the community. Officer Grant stepped forward, towering over Maria. "We can take this down to the station. You can come with us, and we'll do a full body search there. But if you want to save yourself the embarrassment of being dragged out of here in cuffs, you'll cooperate right now." Maria's eyes narrowed slightly. She kept her voice low and even. "Embarrassment?" she asked. "You've already tried to humiliate me in front of all these people. You've already shouted accusations without proof. What more do you think you'll gain from this?" Somewhere in the crowd, a woman called out, "She showed you the receipt. Let her go." Another voice, a man's this time, added, "This is wrong. You can't just accuse people because you feel like it." But the officers ignored them, as though the voices of ordinary citizens did not matter. Grant lifted his chin, his pride swelling. We do what we think is necessary, and right now we think she's hiding something. Turn around, he ordered, pointing toward the small office near the exit where private searches were usually conducted for suspected shoplifters. Maria didn't move. Instead, she locked her eyes on both officers. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Think carefully. This decision will follow you. Her words were calm, but the quiet authority in her tone unsettled them for a brief second. Miller shifted uncomfortably, but Grant's pride would not let him back down. Yes, Grant said, his voice sharp. We're sure. Now move. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Shoppers whispered among themselves, debating whether they should pull out their phones to record, or whether staying silent was safer. A teenage boy near the counter lifted his phone discreetly, capturing the scene while his mother pulled at his sleeve nervously. Don't, she whispered, but the boy shook his head. People need to see this. Maria finally moved, not because she accepted their authority, but because she knew the storm was building, and the truth would only strike harder when revealed at the right moment. She followed the officers toward the office, her steps steady and unafraid. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the air smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning spray. The door shut behind them, cutting off the murmurs of the crowd. Grant pointed to the table. Put your things down again. Maria placed her bags down calmly, watching them sift through each item as though they might magically find something that wasn't there before. When again they found nothing, Miller leaned against the wall, his frustration masked by arrogance. You're hiding it on your body, he declared. Empty your pockets. Remove your jacket. Maria sighed quietly, her patience thinning but her face showing nothing but calm. She slipped off her light jacket, revealing her plain blouse underneath. She pulled out her phone and wallet from her jeans pocket and set them on the table. Still, the officers weren't satisfied. Grant folded his arms. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Admit it now and maybe we won't make a scene at the station. Maria's eyes locked on his. You already made a scene, she said. The entire store saw how far you were willing to go without proof. The only thing left now is how badly you want this to end for yourselves. Her words made Miller frown. He looked at Grant, uncertain for the first time. What if she's telling the truth? He asked in a low voice. Grant shot him a glare. She's lying. They always lie. Maria stood silently, letting them argue for a moment. She knew her training gave her an advantage they could not see. She had learned long ago that the most powerful weapon wasn't anger or shouting. It was patience. Letting someone dig their own grave was far more effective than pushing them into it. The door to the office opened slightly, and the store manager peeked in nervously. Officers, he said, his voice trembling. Maybe it would be better to check the security footage first. It's standard procedure. Grant snapped at him. Stay out of this. The manager quickly withdrew, the door closing with a soft click. Maria let out another slow breath. She knew the situation was reaching its breaking point. They had crossed the line from suspicion into humiliation, and now they were moments away from discovering who she really was. She gave them one last chance, her voice calm and steady. This is the last time I'll ask. Are you absolutely sure you want to continue? Because once you take that step, there's no turning back. Grant smirked, mistaking her composure for weakness. Oh, we'll continue, and we'll prove what you are. Maria straightened, her eyes cold and unflinching. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The storm she had been warning them about was only seconds away, and when it broke, their arrogance would crumble into fear. The room was thick with silence, broken only by the sound of Grant's gloves snapping as he prepared for a more invasive search. Miller swallowed hard, his earlier confidence slipping. Maria's calm expression didn't waver. She stood tall, her dignity untouched, while the two men unknowingly prepared to uncover the truth that would turn their faces pale. The small office felt colder than the rest of the store. The bright white light above seemed too harsh, casting long shadows against the walls. Maria stood silently, her shopping bags neatly set aside on the table. She watched the two officers move around her, trying to intimidate her with their presence. They believed they had the upper hand, but Maria's steady composure gave nothing away. She had dealt with far greater threats than these men. Yet she knew this situation was dangerous in its own way. It was not about weapons or violence, it was about dignity, justice, and prejudice. Officer Grant pulled on his gloves with a snap. making sure the sound echoed in the room. He wanted to see her flinch, to see fear in her eyes, but Maria only blinked slowly and stayed calm. Officer Miller stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his expression less certain than before. He was younger, less experienced, and the way Maria carried herself was beginning to make him uneasy. Still, he followed Grant's lead. "Empty your pockets. Lift your arms," Grant ordered. His voice was filled with arrogance. Maria quietly placed her hands out, allowing them to pat down her sleeves and sides. The officer's hands were rough and careless. They searched for something that wasn't there, convinced that their suspicion was truth. When Grant finished, he stepped back and shook his head. "Nothing," he muttered, frustrated. Miller stepped forward. "She's hiding it somewhere else. People like her always think they can outsmart us." His words carried that same tone Maria had heard earlier. Words meant to degrade, not to find the truth. Maria's patience was running thin, but her voice stayed calm. "You've searched my bags. You've checked my pockets. You've found nothing because there is nothing. You are walking deeper into a mistake with every second that passes." Grant laughed, though the sound felt hollow. "You're bluffing," he said. "We'll find what you're hiding." He leaned closer. "Take off your jacket fully." Maria unzipped her jacket slowly, deliberately. She placed it on the table and stood straight in her blouse, her face unreadable. The officers moved in again, patting down her sides and back. This time, Miller's hand brushed against something firm beneath the fabric near her waist. His eyes widened slightly. "Wait," he said. "There's something here." Grant smirked as though he had won. "Knew it," he said, reaching forward quickly. But the moment he pulled back her jacket and saw the hard edges of a leather holster, the color drained from his face. His hand froze, his eyes darting to the golden badge gleaming against the dark leather. The badge was unmistakable. The letters were bold, the seal shining under the bright light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Grant's face turned pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Miller's smirk disappeared instantly. He stepped back, his hand trembling slightly as his eyes moved from the badge to Maria's calm, unwavering expression. Maria finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Now you understand." The silence in the room was deafening. Grant stammered, trying to recover. This doesn't mean—" Maria cut him off with a sharp glance. "It means exactly what you think it means. You just body searched a federal agent without cause in front of an entire store of witnesses. Do you know what that means for your careers? For your department?" Miller swallowed hard. You should have said something earlier," he whispered. Maria tilted her head slightly. "Why should I have to? I gave you every chance to stop. I told you to check the cameras. I told you to look at the receipt. I warned you more than once. But you chose pride over truth. You chose prejudice over reason. Now you face the consequences." Grant wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his confidence completely shattered. The arrogance that had filled the room only minutes before had vanished, replaced by panic. He muttered, "This can be cleared up. It was just procedure." Maria's eyes hardened. No, this was not procedure. This was harassment. This was humiliation. And now it is obstruction of a federal agent. Miller's breathing grew shallow. He realized the depth of the situation. Detaining an FBI agent without proof, humiliating her in public, then conducting an invasive body search. All of it was not just wrong, it was unlawful. Their careers, their reputations, even their badges were now on the line. Maria reached calmly for her phone in her bag, pulled it out, and tapped a number. She placed the call on speaker. A man's voice answered on the second ring. "Dawson, is everything all right?" The room froze again. Maria's eyes never left the two officers as she replied, "I'm currently being detained and body searched by 2 officers from the city police. They've accused me of shoplifting, ignored the receipt, and disregarded the cameras." The man's voice grew sharp. "What, are you in danger?" "No," Maria said, her tone steady. "But they have crossed every line. I need this reported." The officers stared at the phone, their faces pale. They had no doubt now who she was speaking to, her direct supervisor, someone high in the FBI chain. Grant's voice trembled. "Ma'am, Agent Dawson, we didn't know. Maria raised her hand, cutting him off. "You didn't care to know. You assumed. You judged. And now you will answer for it." The call ended, but the damage was already done. The officers exchanged a glance filled with fear. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier. Maria calmly put her jacket back on, adjusting it neatly as though nothing had happened. When she opened the door, the crowd outside turned to look. The whispers grew louder. Some had already guessed what had happened. Others waited eagerly for the truth. The store manager stood frozen near the counter, his eyes wide as Maria stepped out, followed by the pale-faced officers. Maria looked at the crowd briefly. She didn't need to say anything. Her calm, unshaken expression told the story. The teenage boy who had been filming earlier lowered his phone slowly, realizing the weight of what he had captured. The truth was now out of the officer's hands. Grant tried to speak, his voice unsteady. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's been a misunderstanding," but his words fell flat. The crowd murmured louder, disbelief and anger filling their voices. "Misunderstanding?" someone said. "You humiliated her in front of everyone," another voice shouted. "You had no proof." Maria turned to the officers one last time. Her voice was steady and strong. "This isn't over. You will be held accountable." She picked up her shopping bags, walked past the stunned manager, and headed toward the exit. Every step she took was silent yet powerful. A reminder to everyone watching that dignity could never be stolen, not even by those who wore a badge. Behind her, the two officers stood frozen, their faces drained of color, their careers already slipping away. They had no idea how quickly their world had just changed. The air outside the small office was heavy with whispers. Shoppers who had seen the confrontation were restless, their voices low but sharp with judgment. They had witnessed everything, the raised voices, the accusations, the search. And now, as Maria Dawson walked out of that office, calm and dignified with the two officers trailing behind her, pale-faced and shaken, the balance of power in the room shifted completely. Maria carried her shopping bags with ease as though nothing had happened. Her expression was steady, but her presence carried a force that made even the crowd go silent. Every eye followed her as she walked to the counter, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The two officers looked smaller now, stripped of their earlier arrogance. Their shoulders slumped, their confidence drained. The store manager, sweating nervously behind the counter, didn't know whether to speak or stay quiet. Maria placed her bags down and turned, her gaze locking on Officer Grant and Officer Miller. Her voice was calm but carried enough weight to silence the murmurs in the store. "You made accusations without evidence. You humiliated me in public. You searched me illegally. And all of this happened while you ignored proof that was right in front of you." Grant cleared his throat, but the sound came out shaky. It was a misunderstanding," he said weakly. His earlier booming tone was gone. Maria's eyes didn't soften. "No, it was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice. You chose to believe your assumptions over facts. You chose to ignore the cameras. You chose to treat me as guilty before even asking the simplest questions." She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and sharp. "And you did all of that to a federal agent?" A gasp ran through the crowd. The words hit like a wave. Murmurs rose louder now. "She's FBI?" someone whispered. Another voice echoed. "They searched an FBI agent?" The store manager's face turned white. Miller's lips parted, but no sound came out. His hands shook slightly at his sides. Grant tried to regain some control, raising his voice. "Look, Agent Dawson, we didn't know. You should have identified yourself earlier." Maria cut him off immediately. "Why should I have to? Ordinary people face this every single day without the protection of a badge. What excuse do you give them? That you were just doing your job? That you assumed?" Her tone sharpened. "You didn't see an agent. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you abused that." The words landed hard, and the silence afterward was heavier than before. The crowd's sympathy turned into anger directed at the officers. A woman in the back spoke up, her voice firm. "She told you to check the cameras. You ignored her." Another man added, "You were warned and you kept pushing. Don't act like you didn't know what you were doing." Grant's face burned red, but not with pride anymore. This was shame, the kind that sinks deep and doesn't leave. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but Maria raised her phone again. "Supervisor," she said into the speaker. The call connected quickly and a voice answered. "Agent Dawson, report." Maria spoke calmly, her eyes still locked on the officers. "The situation is under control." The officers in question confirmed their actions in front of multiple witnesses. They continue to deny responsibility. "I request immediate documentation of this incident." The voice on the other end grew sharper. "Names and badge numbers, Dawson," Grant stuttered. Wait, look, this isn't necessary. We can. Maria turned her gaze toward the crowd. You all heard that, didn't you? Badge numbers. The teenage boy with the phone lifted it again. Already recording, he said firmly. His voice carried pride now, not fear. Several others nodded, confirming they too had captured parts of the scene. With trembling hands, Miller slowly recited his badge number. His voice cracked halfway and his partner followed reluctantly. The crowd watched with intensity, their eyes like a jury. Every word the officers spoke now was weighed and recorded. There was no escaping it. Maria calmly repeated the numbers aloud for her supervisor. Documented, the voice confirmed. Proceed with protocol, Agent Dawson. Internal Affairs will be notified. The department chief will receive this report within the hour. The officers' faces drained even further. Internal Affairs. The very words were enough to destroy their careers. Maria ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She looked at the store manager, whose face was pale and hands shook as he wrung them together. You allowed this to continue in your store, she said firmly, when you had the power to stop it. You watched as I was humiliated. Do you understand the damage this has caused? The manager stammered, I didn't want to interfere with the police. Maria's gaze didn't soften. Your silence made you complicit. Let that be a lesson. The manager lowered his head, unable to respond. The crowd whispered again, some nodding at Maria's words. Finally, Maria turned back to the officers. Do you have anything else to say? She asked, her tone calm but icy. Grant swallowed hard. He hesitated, looking around at the cameras, the phones, the eyes staring back at him. We're sorry, he forced out. The words sounded weak, almost meaningless. Miller nodded quickly, his face full of regret. Maria studied them for a long moment. Sorry doesn't erase what happened. Sorry doesn't undo the humiliation. And sorry doesn't protect the next person you decide to target. Her voice lowered slightly but grew even sharper. Accountability does. With that, she picked up her shopping bags again and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for her, silent, their eyes filled with respect. Some whispered words of support as she passed. Good for her. She stood up to them. Finally, someone held them accountable. Maria did not pause for praise. Her steps were steady, her back straight. She knew this incident was bigger than her. It was about the people who didn't have a badge, the ones who faced humiliation without the means to fight back. As she walked out of the store, she silently promised herself that this case would not end here. Behind her, the two officers remained frozen, their shame visible to all. They had walked into that store with pride, certain of their authority. They walked out stripped of it, their future hanging by a thread, and every person who had witnessed their actions would remember this day, not as a routine patrol, but as the day arrogance met truth and lost. Maria stepped into the evening air, the cool breeze brushing against her face. She inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle. The battle inside the store was over, but the war for justice was only beginning. She would make sure their actions did not vanish into silence. She would make sure their names were remembered not as protectors, but as examples of what happens when power is abused. And as she walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a message from her supervisor. Report filed. Chief notified. Stand by for further instructions. Maria allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Justice had begun its work. The next morning, the city woke up to the story that had spread far beyond the walls of the department store. Videos recorded by witnesses were already online, shared thousands of times. Headlines appeared on local news sites. FBI agent wrongly accused by police and shoppers capture humiliation of innocent woman. The footage showed every moment, the loud accusations, the refusal to check the receipt, the humiliating search, and finally the officers' pale faces when the badge was revealed. What had begun as a routine shopping trip for Maria Dawson was now a public scandal that shook the community. Maria sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee in her hand, scrolling through her phone. She wasn't surprised by the attention. She knew once the truth had come out, it would ignite something bigger. People who had faced similar humiliation without the protection of a federal badge saw themselves in her story. The difference was that she had the power to push back, and now the spotlight was on the system itself. Her supervisor had already called that morning. Internal Affairs had opened an official investigation. The police chief had been notified directly by the FBI office, and meetings were scheduled for later in the week. Maria listened carefully, gave her account once again, and agreed to appear at the hearing. She wasn't nervous. She had nothing to hide. The officer's actions, on the other hand, were plain for all to see. Meanwhile, the community was buzzing. Outside the police station, small groups of protesters gathered with signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Stop the profiling." Local radio stations discussed the case non-stop. Callers phoned in to share their own stories. Stories of being stopped without cause, searched without reason, judged by appearance rather than actions. Maria's case had become a spark that lit a much larger fire. At the department store, the manager faced his own reckoning. Customers called for accountability, and some even boycotted the store. "Why didn't you step in?" people demanded. The manager had no answer. His silence during the incident was now seen as complicity. He released a statement of apology, but many felt it was too little, too late. For Maria, the hardest part was not the humiliation she faced. It was remembering the countless ordinary people who never got the chance to fight back. As she walked into the FBI office later that week, she carried those voices with her. Colleagues greeted her with respect, some shaking their heads in disbelief that she had gone through such an ordeal. "If it can happen to you," one agent said quietly, "imagine what it's like for people without a badge." At the disciplinary hearing, Maria sat across from Officer Grant and Officer Miller. They looked nothing like the men who had strutted around the store with pride. Their faces were pale, their shoulders heavy, their eyes downcast. They had lawyers beside them, but even legal advice couldn't soften the truth captured on camera. The footage was played before the board. The accusations, the refusal to listen, the search, and the moment of shocking discovery. Each second was undeniable. Maria gave her testimony in clear, simple words. She didn't embellish. She didn't exaggerate. She spoke of how she was treated, how she was humiliated, how her warnings were ignored. She ended with a sentence that hung in the air long after she spoke it. "I may be an FBI agent, but on that day they didn't see an agent. They saw someone they thought they could bully. And if they can do that to me, they can do that to anyone." The room fell silent. Even the lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The board members nodded gravely. The truth was clear. The officers had abused their authority, and there was no hiding from it. The verdict came quickly. Both officers were suspended without pay, pending further review. Internal Affairs promised a full investigation into their conduct history. Rumors spread that this was not the first complaint against them, but it was the first time their actions had been so clearly exposed. Their careers were hanging by a thread, and the damage to their reputations was already irreversible. Outside, reporters waited for Maria. Cameras flashed as she stepped out of the building, her calm expression unchanged. A journalist asked, "Agent Dawson, what do you hope comes from this case?" Maria paused for a moment before answering. "Justice isn't just about punishing two officers. It's about changing a system that allows assumptions and prejudice to replace truth. I stood up because I could, but I stood up for the people who couldn't." Her words made the evening news, repeated on every channel. They resonated with people across the city and beyond. Letters poured into the FBI office, many from ordinary citizens thanking her for speaking out. Parents wrote about teaching their children courage after hearing her story. Community leaders invited her to speak at local forums about accountability and fairness. Maria accepted some invitations, standing in front of schools, community centers, and churches. She told her story not to glorify herself, but to remind others that dignity must never be surrendered. "The badge doesn't give me worth," she told one group. "Being human does, and that's true for every single one of you." The department store eventually issued a full apology, promising new policies and training for staff. The police department held its own press conference, pledging reforms, though many doubted the sincerity. Still, the case had left a mark too deep to be erased. Weeks later, Maria visited her niece, the little girl who had unknowingly started this whole trip with a birthday gift request. The child ran into her arms, excited to see the dress and books her aunt had bought. Maria smiled, hugging her tightly. In that moment, surrounded by family, she remembered why she had kept calm through the entire ordeal. It wasn't just about her. It was about the world she wanted her niece to grow up in, a world where dignity was protected, not attacked. As the evening settled, Maria stood on the porch, Looking at the quiet street, she thought of the two officers, their pale faces etched into her memory. They had wanted to strip her of her dignity, but in the end they had stripped themselves of theirs. Justice had taken its course, but Maria knew the larger battle continued. Every day, somewhere, someone else faced the same humiliation. She couldn't be there for all of them, but she could use her voice, her story, and her position to make sure the world kept paying attention. She whispered to herself, "No more silence. Not for me, not for anyone." And with that promise, Maria Dawson turned toward the future, not just as an FBI agent, but as a symbol of strength for every person who had ever been falsely accused, every person who had ever been humiliated, and every person who had ever been told they didn't matter. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who believed in dignity, truth, and justice.